I gradually became aware of my surroundings again, as my thoughts emerged from the fog in my head. The dim light in my basement workshop, lit only by the partially open door, mirrored my mood. One of my rackets was still clamped in a vise on the workbench. I could hear our two youngest children playing in the rec room in the Disney movie they were watching on the VCR. Sitting in my worn-out chair, I glanced at the clock on the wall. I had been sitting there for over half an hour, lost in thought. I didn't move. I didn't look, trying to process what I wished I hadn't heard. Sunday dinner was over. My wife Sally cleaned the kitchen while I went down to re-glue some rackets for the upcoming fall racquetball leagues. I had been playing racquetball for 7 or 8 years, often before work as an engineer at GM. I also played in at least one evening league every season. I was proud to have become good enough to play in the A bracket, and often placed first in local tournaments. Playing racquetball helped me maintain my weight at about 200 pounds. At 6'2", our 7-year-old daughter Jessie followed me to watch her favorite movie in the game room, with 4-year-old Allison tagging along. Allie always wanted to be where Jessie was, and thankfully, Jessie didn't seem to mind. For now. I dreaded the day when things would change as Jessie got older. Our 9-year-old son Jason, aware of his role as the oldest boy, often played alone in his room with model airplanes and cars. Jason resembled me and many in the Robinson family. Brown hair, hazel eyes, strong chin, and a prominent but not too large nose. Jessie had Sally's red hair and fine features, while Allie's blonde hair seemed to combine traits from both of us. I finished the handles on the 3 rackets in my gym bag, noticing a couple of strings needed tightening. Murphy's Law ensured a string would break in a league game at least once a week. I checked on the girls who were in the middle of Lady and the Tramp and decided to head upstairs. As I climbed the stairs, I heard Sally talking on the phone. I thought about surprising her to set the mood for later, even though we had already had a morning cuddle. I peeked through the door crack to see her. She still looked beautiful after 3 kids and 10 years of marriage, thanks to regular exercise and a proper diet. We managed to find time for ourselves a couple of times a week. As I opened the door wider, I heard her say, "The schedule is Tuesday and Thursday from 9 to 3. There was a pause, then, "Yes, I can talk. Phil is in the basement with the girls right now." Another pause. "Why?" "Yeah, I think so too, Debbie. I've been thinking about it a lot lately. This coming weekend? I don't think we have anything planned. I could probably do it." Sally was talking to her friend and boss, Debbie Bradshaw, planning another weekend shopping trip. I pushed the door further open and was about to surprise her when I heard Sally giggling. What the hell was that? I thought. She giggled again, listening to Debbie. I hadn't heard Sally giggle like that since our honeymoon. Then she said quietly, "Sure, I'd like to try that thing again before the work comes off." I felt dizzy, as it reminded me of a conversation I'd overheard in a bar months ago. I sank down on the basement step and slowly closed the door behind me. Sally kept laughing and whispering into the phone. I could only make out a few words. "Last time I was really on a roll. I know. Yeah, both of you tell him I'll see him. Ugh, I can't wait." I stood in the dark stairwell as she wound down the conversation. I suddenly didn't want her to know I was there, so I turned quietly, walked back down the stairs, and collapsed into my chair. Reflecting on the conversation, I remembered it happened last spring after one of the last Wednesday night racquetball league games. Afterward, we went to a bar for beers, a monthly ritual. After an hour, only John Harrison, Craig Davis, and I remained. John and Craig were best friends and had joined the Oak Park Y a few years before. John liked beer, while Craig, a recovering heavy drinker, stuck to soft drinks. Craig's drunkenness had strained his marriage since he couldn't handle even a couple of beers. Despite this, he enjoyed the bar atmosphere and joined us whenever he could. Both were married. John had 2 kids, Craig 1. After discussing the matches, the conversation inevitably turned to women. After many bar nights with them, I realized they weren't looking to cheat, but often took an unusual interest in my marriage, making me uncomfortable. That night, Craig teased John about his wife Mary, insisting he have a personal surgery. Thinking he meant a vasectomy, I mentioned Sally wanted me to get one too, but we hadn't agreed yet. Craig, smirking, clarified, "Oh no, she wants him to remove the wart," laughing heartily. Confused, I asked, "What are you talking about?" John blushed and explained he had a wart that had grown over the years, scaring his wife. John claimed it served an important function, but Mary wanted it gone despite any supposed benefits it provided in their bed life. I decided to leave as the conversation got too deep. Now, sitting in the dark, I couldn't believe Sally could be involved in what her phone call hinted at. She knew John and Craig were my racquetball buddies, but they had never met her as far as I knew. The dots, however, seemed to connect. I broke into a sweat, hoping for a plausible explanation. It was clear Debbie was involved too. Debbie Bradshaw, Sally's boss, had become assistant manager of the store where Sally worked after being transferred from corporate headquarters. She and Sally became friends when they were both pregnant. Their daughters were born a month apart. We socialized with Debbie and her husband Josh a few times, usually at work events. Debbie was smart, beautiful, and always the center of attention, while Josh seemed focused on his work. John and Craig joined the racquetball league about 2 years ago. John owned a construction business, and Craig was the managing partner of a residential construction company. We were all married with families and had a lot in common, but we only socialized around racquetball. One day when I mentioned where Sally worked, John said he knew someone there, Debbie Bradshaw, who had graduated from the same high school as John and Craig. They saw each other a couple of times a year. The shopping trips began about 2 years ago when our youngest, Allie, was going through the terrible twos. Sally was overwhelmed with Allie and Jessie, who was only home half the day from daycare. Juggling 3 kids, housework, and a part-time job was exhausting for her, and I wasn't much help, working extra hours on a project. One night, she broke down on the couch, sobbing with frustration. I held her until she calmed down and she said she needed a break. Feeling guilty, I offered to take care of the kids on her next day off. She tearfully thanked me and said she'd think about it. A couple of weeks later, Sally mentioned she talked to Debbie about needing a break. Debbie suggested a shopping trip to the suburbs of Detroit. Despite my reservations, I agreed. So, on my next free weekend, Sally and Debbie left on Saturday morning. They had breakfast, shopped, checked into a motel, had dinner, and saw a movie. I insisted she call me with her hotel details, which she did. They returned the next day around 5 p.m. Sally was so grateful she hugged and kissed me and talked about the stores and restaurants. She didn't go on a shopping spree, but bought a few nice things for herself and the kids. I was happy for her, and the kids behaved well, so I had no complaints. That was over 2 years ago. Since then, the shopping trips became a regular occurrence every 3 or 4 months. Sally and Debbie would leave Saturday morning and return late Sunday night. I enjoyed spending time with the kids, and it pleased Sally. I recalled that after the second trip, Sally seemed sullen and nervous. She claimed it was nothing, just her period. I realized we never made love the night she returned from a trip, though we always did before she left. As the trips continued, Sally seemed almost giddy in the week leading up to them. Sally called from the top of the stairs. "Phil, it's bath time for the girls. Can you send them upstairs?" I sat there gathering my thoughts. Phil, can you hear me?" I got up, walked to the stairs, and called back sourly. "Yes, I heard you. I'll get them." After some argument, I got the kids upstairs. I wandered around, picking up things to kill time and calm my emotions. Finally, I went upstairs. Sally was in the kitchen looking through a cookbook. She smiled and asked, "Is something wrong, honey? Did you get the impression?" Feeling awkward, I mumbled about finding a crack on one of my favorite rackets, but I kept looking into her eyes for any sign of my suspicions. There was nothing. She laughed and kissed me again. "Debbie called while you were downstairs. She wanted to know if we could go shopping at the end of next week." At those words, her eyes narrowed briefly. I knew she was hiding something. I tried to think of a way to postpone the trip. "Don't we have something planned for next weekend?" I said unconvincingly. "There's nothing on the calendar," she replied. "I think there's a VFW event on Saturday night. We should go," I said slowly. Sally looked at me appraisingly. "Phil, you know I don't like those events. All you guys do is talk about army stuff and drink too much. It bores me. So if you want to go, just get a babysitter while I'm gone." "Then why don't we do something with the kids this weekend? Cedar Point will be open for a few more weeks, and we haven't taken Allie yet. She's old enough to enjoy it," I said, grasping at straws. Sally frowned and her face reddened, a rare sign of her anger. "We just took the kids to Mackinac Island over Labor Day weekend. That was only a couple of weeks ago." "What's gotten into you, Phil? You've never objected to my shopping before." Annoyed, I said, "Never mind. I just thought we could do something together. You and Debbie have a good time. I'm going to make sure the kids go to bed." I turned and headed upstairs. Halfway up, I looked back and saw Sally looking at me strangely. For the rest of the evening, I avoided any serious conversation with her. Like most work nights, I got into bed before Sally and tried to sleep. After a while, she came in, changed into her pajamas, and snuggled up against me, whispering, "Phil, Phil." I pretended to be asleep, breathing shallowly. Eventually, she gave up and rolled away. Once she was asleep, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to sort out my thoughts. I reflected on my life, growing up less than 20 miles from where we lived now in a normal middle-class family. My best friend was Jason, or Jace, as everyone called him. We were inseparable since 4th grade, spending nights at each other's houses, playing sports, and dating girls together. Though not outstanding students, I usually got better grades. In high school, I discovered drafting and decided to become an engineer. I went to a local junior college for engineering technology, commuting from home. Jace didn't know what he wanted to do, so he took general education courses. We both got a deferment from the military draft. At the end of my freshman year, I got a DUI and spent all my savings on fines, losing my driver's license for a year. Feeling discouraged, I decided to enlist in the Army, hoping my drafting skills would keep me out of Vietnam. Jace joined me, and we enlisted as buddies. Basic training was tough, but manageable. Midway through, we took aptitude tests and were assigned as fire control specialists, operating advanced calculators for artillery. We trained at Fort Sill, then got orders for Vietnam. After a 15-day leave, we flew to I Corps, Republic of Vietnam. We managed to get assigned to Battery A, 2nd Battalion, 11th Artillery Brigade. It was November 1969, and Nixon was reducing troop levels. For the first few months, we saw little combat, mostly flying sorties and participating in a few raids. The highlight was a vacation in Bangkok, Thailand. After 15 days of partying, we returned to find our unit attached to the 3rd Brigade of the 101st Airborne Corps. A few days later, we were airlifted to a remote hill in dense jungle. 4 months later, I came home on a stretcher. Jace came home in a body bag. I was deeply depressed from the trauma I suffered. I spent weeks in the hospital and months in rehab, along with seeing a psychiatrist. Once deemed almost fit for duty, I was sent to Fort Sill as an assistant instructor. I avoided others, enrolled in local college courses, and spent my off-duty hours writing. After a year, I applied for early release to go back to school. The Army approved, and I was released 5 months early. I moved back in with my parents and applied for veterans benefits. Living at home, my expenses were minimal, covered by savings, education benefits, and a part-time job. I was a typical shell-shocked, confused Vietnam veteran. Society's reaction to the war and my experiences turned me into a bitter recluse. I grew my hair and beard, wore a hooded sweatshirt or an old army jacket, ratty jeans, and worn sneakers. I walked to school, work, and home. My family worried about me, but I felt socially withdrawn. I still saw a therapist once a month, which didn't help much. Once a week, I visited Jace's parents to reminisce about him. They seemed to appreciate it, and it was the least I could do. One afternoon, I was studying in the Campus International Center. A voice broke my concentration. "Mind if I sit here?" A man stood across the table with long red hair and a pale complexion. Curious brown eyes stared into mine. I nervously looked at her red lips, wondering what they would feel like on mine. "Do you mind if I sit here?" she repeated. "No. Go ahead," I muttered. She put her books down and sat. For the next half hour, she studied while I pretended to. Occasionally, I glanced at her, marveling at her looks. Eventually, she noticed and asked, "Are you a veteran?" I nodded. "Vietnam?" she asked. I flinched but said, "Yes." "My dad is a Korean War veteran. He was a Marine," she said, making me relax. "He was even wounded," she added casually. Civilians, I thought with disgust, but nodded and told her I had been in the Army for almost 3 years, avoiding mentioning Vietnam. We talked until she had to go to class. She said goodbye and left. She was the first woman I really talked to after coming home. A few days later, I heard the familiar voice again. "Hey, mind if I sit here?" This time I responded more coherently. She started talking to me like we were old friends. Blushing, she realized she didn't know my name. "It's Phil. Phil Robinson," I said. She laughed. "Sally Baxter. Nice to meet you." We had long breaks between classes on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, and met regularly. I learned about her family, friends, career, and college plans. She was beautiful, outgoing, and sociable, reminding me of Jace. I told her about my family and classes, but avoided Army topics. I was fascinated by her and started shaving and dressing better. My mom noticed and was happy about the change. A few weeks after we met, I worked up the courage to ask Sally out. She was pleased and said yes right away. We both commuted from home for classes, so I offered to pick her up Friday night. She warned, laughing, "My dad can be tough on guys who ask me out. Are you sure you want to do this?" I replied, "Sally, for the privilege of dating you, I can handle your dad for a few minutes or even a lifetime." She blushed and called me a flatterer. Friday night, I knocked on her door and was greeted by a warm, smiling woman. "You must be Phil. We've been expecting you. Please come in." She took my hand and pulled me inside, calling over her shoulder, "Jack, Sally's beau is here." Turning to me, she said, "Don't worry about Sally's father. He's not as bad as she thinks. I'm Emily," shaking my hand. Her father appeared, a big guy about my height but heavier. "I'm Jack," he said, shaking my hand firmly. "Come into the family room. We can talk while Sally finishes her work." We walked into a cozy room with a TV, couch, and armchairs. The room had a fireplace with military memorabilia and an M1 Garand rifle. Jack proudly told me he was a Marine in Korea, wounded twice. "Sally mentioned that. Tough times," I said. "Sally said you were in Vietnam?" Jack asked. "I was a fire control specialist in an artillery battery, 1555, I replied. He nodded approvingly. 155s are the workhorses of artillery. What part of Vietnam? Our battery was all over I Corps. Jack looked at me, unsure if I was a real soldier. I Corps, huh? Marine country. By the time I got there, the Marines were mostly out. Jack snorted. Yeah, Vietnamization. Great term for take this country. It's yours. Emily interrupted. Jack, it's not over. It's over. Except for the screaming. Just wait and see, he insisted. Thankfully, Sally walked in, ending the conversation. We talked briefly about school and our plans, then left. That night, we went to dinner and a movie. I was absorbed in our conversation and don't remember much about the movie. In the theater, we held hands and sat close. Afterward, we stopped by a bar for a drink. I walked her to her door just before her curfew. I stood awkwardly, wanting to kiss her but afraid to ruin the night. She wrapped her arms around my neck, looked into my eyes and whispered, "Thank you, Phil, for a wonderful evening." I realized I had fallen in love with her. I put my hands on her waist and kissed her gently. From that day on, we cuddled like this often, looking into each other's eyes, hiding nothing. Reluctantly, she pulled away and went inside. The next day, I called Sally and we talked for an hour. We set up another date for midweek and soon we became exclusive. A few weeks later, I told her I had booked a motel room for Saturday. She blushed but smiled and nodded. That evening was perfect. There were a few awkward moments when she saw my scars from Vietnam, but I reassured her that I was fine. I whispered, "Sally, I love you. You probably don't want to hear it, but I can't help it." She looked at me with tears in her eyes and smiled. "I love you too, Phil. I never knew it could be like this. I want to stay like this forever." I laughed and kissed her nose. "I don't know about forever, but I sure want to do this again and again." She laughed, then moaned as I entered her. "God, Phil, anything you want." For the first time since losing Jace, I felt at peace, hopeful for the future. By the time we left the motel in the early morning, we knew we wanted to be together for life. We talked about marriage, children, and our future. Sally was graduating a year before me, so she would work until I graduated. Then we'd marry. I planned to rent an apartment so we could be together. A week later, I introduced Sally to my parents. My dad, Dave, worked at GM, and my mom, Donna, was a part-time teacher's aide. They loved Sally for herself and for how she brought me out of my shell. I was happier and couldn't stop smiling. My therapist even told me to stop coming because I was doing so well. Sally's father, Jack, was wary of me, especially when we talked about living together before marriage. Things changed when Jack and Emily invited us to dinner. Jack and I talked while the women were in the kitchen. He asked about my scars from Vietnam, and I reluctantly told him I had been at Firebase Ripcord in the summer of '70. Jack, a Marine, knew of Ripcord and his attitude toward me softened. From that moment, he treated me like the son he never had. Sally graduated with honors and got a job as an assistant buyer at a retail store. She spent a lot of time with me at my apartment. I graduated on time and got a job at GM as a draftsman. 2 months later, we were married. With both of us working, we bought a small house with room to expand. A year later, our son Jason was born, named after my best friend. 2 years later, we had Jesse, and 3 years after that, Allison was born. Having Jason was special, but the girls wrapped me around their little fingers. Sally cut back to part-time work when Jason was born, planning to return full-time once all the kids were in school. Her hours varied between 12 and 20 hours a week, which suited her because she got a large employee discount, helping keep the kids clothed. Since starting work, my role evolved from translating part designs into programs for automated manufacturing to being part of the first computer-aided design systems. When Ali was born, life was good. We had money, 2 cars, and a nice house. We expanded the house and took family vacations every year. Sally and I sent the kids to their grandparents twice a year for our own weekends together. Our marriage seemed strong, filled with love and affection. I often told Sally how lucky I felt, but now I wasn't so sure. Sleep eluded me, and I barely managed a couple of hours each night. The next morning, I skipped the Y, staggered into my office, and shut the door, staring at the wall. I needed a plan to figure out what was going on. Should I ask Sally directly? Would she tell me the truth if she was hiding something? I doodled on my notepad, planning my next steps, but felt lost when considering the worst-case scenario. I loved Sally and my children, and the thought of losing them terrified me. For the next few days, I was a zombie at work and home. Sally didn't notice until Jace asked about my strange behavior. I blamed it on a work project. By Tuesday, I returned to my routine, playing racquetball before work with John and Craig. Realizing they were always together, I suspected both were involved in something. In the locker room, John laughed and Craig smirked as if sharing a joke. For the first time, I saw them as adversaries. We played a few pickup games and exchanged small talk. On Wednesday, I decided to check on John and Craig. I called John's wife, saying I was from his racquetball league and wanted to see if he could play on Saturday. She said he was going to a business conference in Detroit and would return on Sunday. My heart sank. I called Craig's house and got the same answer from his wife. It was true. The four of them had hooked up. How far it went didn't matter. It was too far. I was angry, and a voice in my head urged me to act. Friday night, I visited my parents. They were planning to spend the winter in Florida and renovating their house. I needed to talk to them, so we sat at the kitchen table. Finally, I sighed and said, "I think Sally is cheating on me." Tears streamed down my face as I sobbed. It was the first time I'd said it out loud. Mom and Dad were shocked. "No, this can't be happening. Not Sally. She wouldn't do that to you," whispered Mom. "Son, why do you think that?" asked Dad quietly. I recounted everything I overheard and learned. Mom cried quietly, shaking her head. Dad hugged her tightly. "What do you want from us, Phil?" Dad asked. "I need to know for sure. Can you pick up the kids tomorrow and keep them until Sunday?" I pleaded. Dad nodded. "Sure, Phil, but I hope this is all a misunderstanding." "I hope so too, but it's hard to see how it could be." I left, and when I got home, Sally was finishing dinner. She turned, hugged me, and kissed me. "The kids are in the rec room. Dinner will be ready in 20 minutes, she said cheerfully. She seemed excited about the weekend. I hesitantly said, "Honey, we haven't made love since last weekend. How about we put the kids to bed early tonight?" Sally stepped back, her smile becoming forced. "Phil, I'd love to, but I got my period early today," she said. I replied, "Oh, sure, I understand." She stroked my cheek and said, "Once my period is over, I'll explain everything. I promise." "Okay." I tried not to break free from her arms. "Yeah, then it's a date," I muttered. She hugged me and went back to making dinner. Her periods had always been regular. I realized she was saving herself for her date. Anger and the urge to act grew stronger. The next day, we followed our usual Saturday routine. The older kids cleaned their rooms, then watched cartoons. I fiddled in the garage until it was time for Sally to leave. She came downstairs with her suitcase, yelling at the kids to behave. Allie behind her yelled, "Buy me something, Mommy." Sally hugged and kissed Allie. "I will, sweetie. Be good for Daddy." She kissed me and said, "I have to go. I need to pick up Debbie. Don't forget to call me when you get to the hotel." "Which one?" "The Red Roof Inn in Rochester Hills." "Bye," she said, and left. I watched her drive away, then went back inside and told Jason and Jesse to pack a bag. We were going to Grandma and Grandpa's. They packed with some fussing, and I helped Allie gather her things. Mom and Dad were waiting when we arrived. As I left, Dad gave me a concerned look. "Good luck, Phil. I hope you're wrong." "Me too, Dad. Thanks. I'll call you in the morning." I headed home, stopping at Avis to switch cars. I didn't want mine to be recognized. A couple of hours later, I was still sitting in the kitchen when the phone rang. It was after 1 p.m. I picked it up. "Is that you, Phil?" Sally asked. "Yeah, it's me." I was annoyed by the interruption, though I had been expecting it. I was thinking about Jason, Jesse, and Allie, my top priority now. "Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine, just fine. Is everything okay with you?" I asked sarcastically. "We're fine. We stopped for lunch. We're staying in room 168, number 555-645-0168. We made small talk for a few minutes. Then she said, "Debbie is waving at me. I have to go. We're spending the afternoon at Meadowbrook Village Shopping Center. See you tomorrow." She hung up without waiting for me to say goodbye. She didn't even say she loved me this morning when she left. I called the Red Roof Inn and asked if Sally Robinson had checked in. They said yes and offered to connect me, but I declined. Then I asked if John Harrison was registered. They said yes, but he hadn't arrived yet. I hung up. Trying to suppress my anger, I went to the workshop and unlocked the weapon cabinet. I stared at my dad's old 16-gauge rifle, a Winchester Model 73 rifle, and an old machine weapon handle. I bought the Winchester in high school. I couldn't bear hunting after Vietnam. I realized if I took my weapon, I might never see my children again. Instead, I found an old Ka-Bar knife I bought in Bangkok, strapped it to my calf, and gathered a few essentials. At 2 a.m., I began the 90-mile drive to Rochester Hills. I arrived at the Red Roof Inn and parked near room 168. I didn't see Sally's car, so I waited. At 5 a.m., I saw a red pickup truck I recognized. John and Craig got out, laughing and talking, and went into the room next to Sally's. After 45 minutes, they left for Tupper's Pub. I followed them and saw Sally's car parked there. I decided not to go inside the small bar to avoid being noticed. I parked on the street and waited. At 9 a.m., the four of them left the bar, laughing and holding hands. I returned to the hotel and parked where I could see both the front door and John's truck. They arrived shortly after and stood in front of room 168, talking and laughing. John flipped a coin and Craig kissed Sally. Debbie pulled John into the other room. The two couples, holding hands, went to different rooms. Stunned, I realized what was happening. It wasn't the first time. 10 years of marriage and family were ruined. The voice in my head screamed, "Do something, anything." But what could I do now? I thought I knew the answer. At least I would sleep better knowing I tried. Then John came out of Debbie's room in boxers and a t-shirt, holding a beer. I realized I'd been staring at their door for over an hour. John checked to see if anyone was watching, then knocked on Sally's door. Craig came out in jeans, no shirt or shoes, and they talked for a few minutes, high-fived, and switched rooms. It hit me what was happening. A voice screamed in my head, "Do something, idiot!" I put on my driving gloves, got out of the car, and walked to room 168. I knocked twice, and when John opened the door, I punched him hard. He fell back, clutching his face. I pulled out my knife and pointed it at him. "How long, John? How long has this been going on?" I demanded. 2 years, he stammered. "So joining the racquetball league wasn't a coincidence?" I asked, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "No," he replied, closing his eyes in pain. "You're a sick idiot, John. If you ever go near Sally or any other married woman again, I'll find you. Understand?" "Yes," he wheezed. "You better leave town," I added. His eyes bulged with horror as he lost control of his bowels. The shower stopped and Sally's voice called out, "Hey, John boy, I thought you were joining me in the shower. What's up?" She appeared in the bathroom doorway, saw me, and went pale. The towel fell from her hands. "John boy doesn't seem well," I growled. She slammed the door shut. I cut the phone cord with my knife and left the room, screaming in frustration and throwing the phone into the bathroom, causing Sally to scream. I stepped outside and walked to Craig's room, knocking twice. Craig opened the door, laughing. "You guys are noisy." I punched him under the chin, and he collapsed. Debbie, sitting in bed, looked terrified. I pulled the phone cord from the wall. "If you tell your husband you saw me tonight, say hi for me," I said sarcastically, then added, "Or maybe I'll tell him myself." I tossed the phone into the corner and left. Outside, I looked up at the night sky, breathing deeply. The tension faded, replaced by a soothing tiredness. The voice telling me to act was gone. I headed to my car, ready to move on with my life. "Yes," I said abruptly into the phone. I was annoyed by the interruption, though I had been expecting it. I was focused on my children, Jason, Jesse, and Allie, figuring out how to protect them from the fallout of the situation. "Phil, it's Jack." "Yeah, Jack," I replied without enthusiasm. "What's going on?" "Sally was here when her mom and I got home from church. She's crying and afraid to go home," Jack said, almost shouting. I checked the time. It was almost 1 p.m., about 14 hours since I left Rochester Hills. "I don't know what I could have done to make her feel that way," I said. "She says you lashed out at a couple of Debbie's friends last night. Hurt them badly." "Hurt them? They're lucky I didn't eliminate them," I said sarcastically. "Phil, that's not like you." Jack paused. "Sally said it happened outside a restaurant in Rochester Hills." "Her history, Sally is your daughter, so it must be true," I said slowly. Silence filled the phone as Jack processed this. "Phil, I'm bringing Sally home. We need to talk." "No problem." Jack hung up, but I heard Sally in the background saying, "No, Dad, no." I sighed. This wasn't going to be easy. I was sitting at the kitchen table, looking at old photos and mementos in my shoebox, finishing my second beer. When they arrived, Jack walked in, followed by Sally, who tugged on his arm. "Please, Dad, let us work this out. Phil and I need some alone time." Sally's eyes were red and puffy. She was trembling. She didn't meet my gaze, holding onto her father's hand, trying to guide him back to the door. But Jack wouldn't budge. He sat at the table, staring at me, then at the knife lying next to my beer. "Okay, Phil, what's going on?" Jack asked, his voice firm. I looked at Sally and said mockingly, "Yeah, Sally, tell your dad what's going on." "Shut up, Phil. You and I can work this out," she said fiercely, her eyes pleading. I was infuriated by her belief that things could be fixed if we were alone. I looked Jack in the eye. "Turns out Sally and her boss, Debbie, have some girlfriends they like to see when they're out of town. I found out and objected strongly." Sally sighed, sat down, and looked defeated. "No, Phil, Sally wouldn't do that. I don't believe you," Jack said angrily. "That's enough, Phil. You're being cruel and disrespectful," Sally interjected. "Cruel and disrespectful? You should have seen what I saw in her hotel room." "Another man's footprints," I said coldly. Jack turned to Sally. Her frightened expression confirmed my words. He collapsed into his chair, covering his face. "Oh, God," he murmured. Sally turned pale and teary. "Please, Dad, don't tell Mom. We can work this out, Phil, can't we? Please, Phil," she pleaded. I sat in silence, going through the old photos and mementos, thinking back to a time of immense pain. After a few minutes, Jack straightened up and wiped his eyes. "What are you going to do, Phil?" he asked, looking at Sally's tear-streaked face. I thought for a moment. "I never told either of you about Vietnam or Ripcord. I never told anyone, not even my therapist." I gestured to the pile of stuff on the table. "Isn't it ironic, Jack, that your generation displays its war memorabilia for all to see, while mine hides it in a shoebox in the bottom drawer?" "Why is that?" I asked rhetorically. I held up a faded photo of two young, skinny guys in jungle uniforms, grinning like Vietnam was a Boy Scout outing. Had I ever been that young? I felt old now. I tossed the picture on the table between Jack and Sally and started talking like I was lecturing strangers. "Jace and I were dropped off at Ripcord in May 1971. It was just another base in a string of bases for our battery. We'd airlift howitzers, set them up, conduct firing operations for a month or two, and then move on. But Ripcord was different. We were on a desolate ridge surrounded by thick jungle, overlooking the A Shau Valley near the Laos border, a place with a bloody history for the U.S. military. The firebase consisted of our 155-weapon battery, a mortar platoon, and a company of infantry to guard the perimeter. We had 2 helicopter landing pads and a few other units, totaling about 400 men. Most of the firebase was underground in bunkers and trenches. Near the end of the battle, we learned we were surrounded by about 12,000 North Vietnamese soldiers. It was like your Marines at Chosin Reservoir, Jack. Jack nodded slowly, lost in his memories. The first 6 weeks weren't bad for us, but for the soldiers dropped off on the hilltops around us, it was hell. We were constantly on missions to support them, with helicopters coming and going from dawn to dusk. On July 1st, everything changed. We came under mortar fire for the first time. For the first week, the NVA fired 20 to 30 shells daily. Then they started using larger mortars and weapons. Because of the wind and noise, we often couldn't hear the incoming artillery. One day I was caught off guard running to the fire control bunker when a mortar explosion knocked me down. I made it to the bunker and Jace said, "Damn, Phil, you're bleeding." I had been shot by shrapnel under my right shoulder blade. I was evacuated to Camp Evans, where they removed the shrapnel and kept me for observation due to a concussion. By the time I got back to Ripcord, getting a shrapnel wound was common. The shelling got heavier, with rocket-propelled grenades and recoilless weapons adding to the chaos. We were taking 70 to 80 shells a day. Our weapons were in constant action, firing at close targets. Chinook helicopters brought in ammunition under fire, dropping their loads without landing. We'd rush to grab the shells and powder charges. During one of these operations, I got more shrapnel wounds. We were exhausted from the constant shelling and work. Artillery planes, F-4 Phantoms, and B-52S were always around, conducting airstrikes. Smoke and tear gas filled the air. By July 8th, we were on alert every night, expecting a perimeter assault. As the shelling continued, casualties mounted, and morale plummeted. It felt like we were abandoned. We lost over 500 men eliminated or wounded. I had to carry body bags or stretchers to the helipad for evacuation. On July 18th, a Chinook carrying howitzer shells was damaged and crashed over a 115 battery and an ammunition supply point, causing explosions and fires for hours. All 6 weapons were destroyed, and several men were wounded. I saw Jack with tears streaming down his face. Many of us rushed to help. Injured men suffered burns. When aviation gas ignited, Jace and I lifted a machine artilleryman onto a stretcher. The skin on his arm came off in my hand. "That and the smell of burning flesh I'll never forget," I whispered. Jack nodded grimly and Sally looked horrified. I continued, "We all knew the place wouldn't hold, but the brass saw an opportunity to hurt the enemy, with almost 4 NVA regiments gathered in one place. A couple of nights later, we were put on alert again. We were bombarded with automatic weapons and conventional fire. Jace and I set up an M60 machine weapon in front of the FDC bunker. Our mortar platoon fired flares to illuminate the wire, and the infantry company returned fire along the jungle edge. Artillery ships flew overhead, firing rockets and rotary cannons. The infantrymen in front of us were firing M79 grenade launchers and automatic weapons into the jungle. Tracer fire occasionally came back. Then a volley of 20 mm mortar rounds shot the infantry position. Jace and I ducked as the ground shook. We saw the infantry trench was completely covered. We quickly took up positions, and Jace began returning fire while I fed him ammo. The platoon sergeant crawled over, and we told him what had happened. He rushed off to get more ammo. As we reached the last belt, I heard an M16 shot and felt like I was slapped with a baseball bat in my back and thighs. I collapsed and stared into Jace's eyes. He realized what had happened. He tried to speak, but couldn't. I reached for his hand. He squeezed it once, and then the light went out in his eyes. It was the end. I looked at Jack and Sally, but didn't see them clearly as tears streamed down my face. My best friend, my brother in everything but name, was dead. I felt so alone. I wiped my eyes, trying to pull myself together. Sally was sniffling, but I couldn't tell if it was for Jace or her own troubles. I continued. I turned my head to look behind me. About 10 feet away, Corporal Tran, a Kit Carson scout, was pointing an M16 at us. These scouts were mostly North Vietnamese deserters who decided they were on the wrong side. Tran spoke English well and sometimes acted as an interpreter. He'd taken shelter in our bunker a few times, and Jace even taught him poker once. The scouts had become increasingly suspicious, and none of us trusted them. Tran fired a full clip at us. I took a couple of bullets in the back, but my body armor saved me from all but a few broken ribs and a concussion. One bullet shot the back of my thigh. I felt myself going into shock, realizing Jace was really gone and I'd been shot. I fought to stay conscious, knowing I would die if I didn't. I focused on my anger at the enemy. Tran tried to shoot again, but he was out of ammo. I played dead. Tran waved a flashlight and shouted in Vietnamese into the jungle. A rocket-propelled grenade flew out, narrowly missing us and exploding behind us. Tran was waving his flashlight like a madman. I saw 3 figures with satchel charges and AK-50 carbines running toward the wire. I knew I had to stop them. I pulled the M60 from beneath Jace, managed to stand, and fired 2 long bursts before the belt was empty. The sappers went down and Tran turned, screaming at me and grabbing a machete. I pushed off the edge of the trench, dropped the M60, and grabbed my knife. We ended up face to face, nearly unconscious. I got on his chest as he tried to reach for the machete. He failed. I don't know how long I sat there in the chaos. Suddenly, Eric, my platoon sergeant, and Lieutenant Dixon pulled me up. Dixon yelled to get back to the bunker because napalm was coming. I paused, took a sip of beer, and ran the tip of my knife over the 3 Purple Heart medals on the table. Jack and Sally were silent, barely breathing. I couldn't look at them. Finally, I continued. I lost consciousness around this time. I woke up in a medical bunker with an IV, and a surgeon and corpsman working on me. Doc said I'd survive and would be flown out at dawn. I ended up being flown out around noon, despite heavy fire. Our helicopter took several shots, and the crew commander was eliminated. Before I left, the decision was made to evacuate Ripcord. Everyone was taken out on the 21st, and the place was bombed. It didn't matter to me anymore. 24 hours later, I was on a flight to a hospital in Japan. After a week there, I was transferred to Walter Reed for another month. A colonel who had never heard of Ripcord handed out medals. They gave me this one for liquidating my enemies. I placed a red, white, and blue medal with a silver star next to the Purple Hearts. The doctors treated me well. After a couple of months of rehab, I was physically fine, but mentally I was a wreck. I had nightmares every night. I missed Jace's funeral, but visited his parents before heading to Fort Sill. They wanted to know everything about Vietnam and how Jace died, but never asked why I survived, and he didn't. That's the question I ask myself every day. I stared into space, reflecting on that dark time. I was in therapy, but felt withdrawn from the world. I did the bare minimum at Fort Sill, immersing myself in college drafting classes to avoid socializing. When I left the Army, I moved back with my parents and continued school. Not because I cared, but because I didn't know what else to do. I looked into Sally's eyes, feeling the pain and resentment from the previous night. "Then I met Sally," I whispered. She suppressed a sob and looked away. "You brought me back to the real world. You were happy, interested in everything, and beautiful inside and out. You made me want to live again. I fell in love with you. You saved me and gave me 3 wonderful children. For that, I will always be grateful." We sat in silence for a few minutes. Jack finally cleared his throat. "What now, Phil?" I looked at him tiredly. "Jack, I've been betrayed twice. Both times I lost my best friend," I said. Sally started to sob. "No, no, no." We sat in silence with tears in our eyes. Jack asked quietly, "Are you sure, Phil? You want to throw it all away because of one mistake?" Sally looked at me with desperate hope. I shook my head. It wasn't the only mistake. I found out last night that Sally had been cheating on me for almost 2 years, and it wasn't with just one man. Sally sighed, closed her eyes, and sank into her chair, even paler than before. "John didn't tell you, Sally, that he confessed to everything?" I turned to Jack. "Does that answer your question?" Jack slowly stood up and looked sadly at Sally. "You are my daughter, and I should love you. But I have lost all respect for you. Your behavior—" Jack stopped, unable to find the words, and shook his head. Sally reached out, but he pulled away. He turned to me. "Phil, you don't deserve this. Do what you have to do, but please don't hurt her." I couldn't sit still. "No, Jack, I'm past that," I said sadly. "But if it makes you feel better, take this." I slipped the knife into its sheath and handed it to him. Jack silently accepted it and turned toward the door, shoulders slumped, probably thinking about how to tell Emily. As soon as the door closed behind him, the phone rang. We sat there, not moving or looking at each other, as the ringing stopped and silence settled in. Finally, I said, "I expected the cops to come to you this morning, not your father." Sally flinched. "Debbie and I convinced them to make up a story about being attacked outside the bar, hoping you wouldn't call their wives." I realized I was free now. They couldn't change their story. But everything was still falling apart. "So where are they now?" I asked. Sally cleared her throat. "They're still in the hospital. You hurt them badly. John has a broken nose, cheekbone, and ribs. Craig has a dislocated jaw, broken teeth, and a concussion. Don't forget their balls, Sally." She looked at me fearfully. "You did some serious damage to them. I never knew you were so cruel, Phil. Did you have to do that?" "You're defending those idiots?" I said sarcastically. Before she could answer, the phone rang again. "You should answer it." "It's probably for you," I said, heading to the bathroom. I washed my face and looked at myself in the mirror. My eyes were red and puffy. I looked old and haggard. After almost a sleepless night, I went back into the kitchen. Sally was standing there, staring at the phone. She slowly hung up and slumped into a chair. When I sat down, she said, "Did you have to tell Debbie's husband?" "Why shouldn't I share his pain? He's already called John and Craig's wives and kicked Debbie out. She'll need a lawyer to see her daughter." Sally started crying again. "She fired me. She said it was all my fault." I laughed bitterly. "Who introduced you to John and Craig? It was Debbie, wasn't it?" Sally asked. "How did you know?" "When I told Josh this morning what you and Debbie did, he didn't believe me, called me a liar. But when I mentioned John Harrison, he changed. He got angry and started swearing. You told me Debbie's second marriage was estranged from her parents and sister. About a year ago, Josh met Sarah, Debbie's sister, during an audit. They had dinner and Sarah told him about Debbie's past. Debbie had cheated on her first husband, Dave, with John Harrison. Josh realized Debbie had been cheating on him too, just like you did to me." Sally stared at me in shock. "When I mentioned John's name, Josh put the pieces together and threw Debbie out. And now I'm wondering how long you've been messing around on me," I said firmly. Sally cried, "Oh my God, Phil, it was only John and Craig, and only during our shopping trips. Please believe me. I never thought about anyone else until Debbie brought it up. Before our first trip," she twisted her handkerchief, alternately crying and begging, "Please, Phil, I don't know how I got here. It feels like a nightmare. When I saw you standing there—" I stayed silent, just looking at her. Encouraged, she started speaking quickly. I knew Debbie liked to play around before we started shopping. She talked about it as the most fun in her marriage, but I didn't expect her to bring anyone along. I was surprised when John showed up at the restaurant. Debbie introduced him, saying she knew him from high school and he was just in the neighborhood. I suspected that wasn't true, but said nothing. She paused, looking away. John was at his best that night, flirting, dancing, complimenting us. I had a few more drinks than usual, and when his hands got loose on the dance floor, I pretended not to notice. Later at the hotel, Debbie went with John to the room next to ours. I realized Debbie had set it all up. The walls were thin, and I could hear them all night. That explains why you were like that when you came home, I said with disgust. Sally nodded, wiping her eyes. The next morning, John was gone. We had breakfast, and Debbie detailed their night together, raving about him all the way home. Over the next few months, Debbie often talked about John during lunch at work, mentioning his ward and joking that I should try it. At first, I laughed it off, but the idea stuck in my head. A few months later, another shopping trip came up, and Debbie said John wanted to be with me and she was fine with it. I laughed but didn't say no. I told her I'd think about it but didn't think I could do it. Sally looked at me and I stared back blankly. I knew it was wrong, but I thought I could do it and no one would know. She looked away again. That Saturday night, John and Craig came to the restaurant. We had dinner, drinks, then went to a nightclub. We split into couples and I was with John. I convinced myself nothing bad would happen. Later at the motel, John and I went to our room and Debbie and Craig to theirs. Sally fell silent. So, was it as you thought it would be? I asked dismissively. Sally looked at me with tears in her eyes. It was okay. No better than what you and I have. It was exciting because it was wrong and with someone new, and I could pretend to be someone else. You mean it turned you on so much you forgot about your husband waiting at home, taking care of your kids out of love for you? I said bitterly. Sally suppressed a sob and turned away. Yes, she whispered. And what about Craig? I asked sarcastically. Without looking at me, she replied, after a few times with John, Debbie joked she missed him. On the next trip, I danced with Craig all night. Later at the motel, Craig came to my room and we spent the night together. It didn't seem like a big deal. A couple of trips later, John and Craig switched in the middle of the night. I didn't realize until I woke up and saw the man making love to me wasn't the one I started with. Sally looked at me sadly. I felt like two different people living in two different worlds. I love our life together, but I got hooked on these weekends. I thought I could have both and you'd never know. How stupid was I? Damn stupid, I agreed. And then when you saw me at the motel, Sally whispered to herself. I looked at myself in the mirror and realized what I'd become. I stood up and looked at her. Interesting story, Sally. Too bad it doesn't have a happy ending. Maybe it does for you. I'm going to get the kids tonight. When Allie is asleep, we'll tell Jason and Jesse that their parents will be living apart. Allie is too young to understand. We won't tell them the real reason, and I'll minimize the trauma for them. I'll sleep on the couch in the basement until I make other arrangements. As I started to walk away, Sally shouted, Phil, my God, this was a mistake. I love you. Don't do this, please. I turned and asked, why not? Sally, sobbing uncontrollably, replied, it was only 3 or 4 nights a year. I never saw John or Craig outside of that weekend. Please, Phil, I'm begging you. Can't you forgive me and let me make things right? Forgive you, Sally. Forgive you for becoming a strumpet for other men 3 or 4 nights a year, for giving away the thing you cherished most in the world, yourself. Forgive you for destroying my trust in you, for destroying my belief that you and I belong to each other and no one else, I said sadly. And how would you fix that? Could you go back in time and start over? Could you avoid having fun with John and Craig? Because that's what it takes to make things right, I said tiredly. I stood silently, looking around the kitchen at the family photos, kids' drawings, and newspapers on the fridge, Allie's baby chair in the corner. All the things that made this house a home. I shook my head, trying to clear it. I spent most of last night without sleep, asking myself how I'll feel about you in 6 months, a year, or 5 years. I'm sure I'll forgive you someday, but I won't be able to forget. Not in a year, not in 5, not in 10. Every time I see you, hear your voice, or hear your name, I'll remember last night. With tears in my eyes, I said, that's what I can't live with. I stood there, contemplating the future, barely noticing Sally rocking back and forth in her chair. sobbing, "No, please God, no." After a few minutes, I said softly, "Can you answer me one question, Sally?" She looked at me with empty eyes, like a condemned prisoner. "You lost the man who loved you more than anything. You lost the respect of your parents, my parents, and your husband. You've lost your job. Someday you'll have to explain to our children why you destroyed our family. Was it worth it?" After a moment of silence broken only by Sally's muffled sobs, I turned and walked out the door.